Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the Dais in person and online. This is our second Dais talks on anti-racism. The theme of tonight's talk is anti-Semitism online and offline in Canada. Those of you who don't know the Dais, we're a public policy and leadership think tank based at Toronto Metropolitan University. Our name means raised platform. A Dais is a place that illuminates the people on it and reminds us that real change only happens when we lift new voices and ideas. And if you're in person, you'd see the pink platform here. It's not raised, but we're working on getting a raised platform at the Dais. Our mission is really develop the people, the ideas, the power that we need to build a more inclusive, innovative, and prosperous Canada. And from our home base at TMU, we're dedicated to working on that through three kind of policy areas: innovation and technology, education and skills, and democracy and trust. We do a lot of work on responsible technology policy, helping to govern the platforms to keep Canadians informed and safe online. And that'll be at least a theme of some of the talk, I believe, this evening, or some of the conversation. Before we begin tonight's event, I'd like to acknowledge that the land that we are on, it's part of a symbolic, it is a symbolic restorative act, but part of a larger transformative reconciliation journey here at Toronto Metropolitan University, which took a very brave step. We actually have a former member of the Board of Governors here who was involved in that work to rename itself, to rename the university. We're gathered here on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. This territory, this part of Toronto, is covered by the District 1 Stream Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. We as treaty people, and we as employees and team members at the Dais at TMU are committed to honoring our obligations to these nations, treaties, and to justice for Indigenous peoples more generally. We do have an anti-racism talk that's focused on Indigenous approaches and the environmental movement in Canada. So look forward to that later. We've also, those who are not Indigenous have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers. But there are also generations past who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And so we also honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. When the Dais team designed this series of anti-racism talks, we did so knowing that the people responsible for creating the laws, regulations, and government priorities that impact all of us are often not people who are most impacted by them. This series provides a Dais, a raised platform for leaders, people on the front lines of policy issues related to racism on the receiving end to come together to share their insights and expertise on issues facing their communities. And tonight we've gathered to discuss the topic of anti-Semitism in Canada. And I'll just say, perhaps like a lot of people who are not of Jewish background, I first encountered anti-Semitism before I encountered Judaism. This is both in history class, yes, but also in the casual offensive language and slang that I encountered in growing up, including vividly remembering in the Scrabble dictionary that I used. And so that was a few of the examples of my encounters with anti-Semitism before encountering Judaism. And so as a half Anglo, half Arab person from small town New Brunswick, who's now, I think, been formed, hopefully, more fully in my understanding of the richness of Judaism, the Jewish experience. Those experiences are things I haven't forgotten, and it's part of, I think, my calling to help support this talk and this work in person. A bit about this talk and why it's so important. It doesn't need much justification. Canada is the fourth largest Jewish community of any country in the world. Anti-Semitism continues to persist, and we'll hear more about that. Hate-driven attacks on people and places in the physical world, hate-driven tropes and calls to violence in the virtual world. Here in Toronto, anti-Semitism has been the most reported hate crime in the city for more than 5 years in a row, according to the Toronto Police Service Hate Crime Unit. And tonight we'll hear from two experts and our expert fellow as they share their experiences, emerging research and trends, and promising policies. Some housekeeping rules. We have 30 minutes or thereabouts for our moderator, Martin Regg, who I'll introduce in a moment, to open the discussion. Submit your discussion to us. So in person, we've got some paper, and also online. Please submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A function. And again, we have question cards here for the people here in person. After around 30 minutes, we'll have a 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene and try to answer as many questions as possible. questions submitted before the break are more likely to be addressed, so we recommend submitting them before. There will also be a chance to mix and mingle with speakers and each other for the last 30 minutes, and we'll wrap that up by around 8 o'clock. The Zoom session will end before that at that time for those joining online. Okay. I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Martin Regg. Martin writes a political column for the Toronto Star focused on Ontario politics and also international affairs. He's a senior fellow of the Dais, foreign correspondent for 11 years, chief of the Middle East and Asia bureaus, and foreign editor of World Affairs Columnist. Continues to write on world affairs in very compelling ways. And he's not primarily writing about Ontario. Reported for more than 40 countries. Okay, great. And nominated 5 times for the National Newspaper Award. He's also the founder of the TMU Democracy Forum, and stay tuned for those events. We posted a very successful event, Ontario Liberal Leadership Debate a few weeks ago. And he is also a senior fellow at another university down the street from here. With that, delighted to welcome Martin, who will introduce our guests.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to our audience here at Toronto Metropolitan University, and welcome if you're joining us online. So we're talking tonight about anti-Semitism online and offline in Canada, part of a series of anti-racism events here at the Dais on campus. This talk will be shaped very much by these 2 amazing experts that I have beside me. We've invited them because of their expertise, but also their personal experiences and talking about a very tough subject. So let me tell you about them first, and then we'll get going. Bernie Farber has had a long career on front lines. I can say that because I've had a front row seat watching him in action, thanks to my own role as a journalist for a long time. I first got to see him when he ran the Canadian Jewish Congress, which was arguably the most effective and most responsive organization of its kind in the country. Bernie wasn't just your average stakeholder. He was a fighter, but also an educator and a bridge builder, which is important. When I was heading off as a foreign correspondent to the Middle East, he called me, as well as a stakeholder perhaps. But in addition to kind of wishing me good luck, he also whispered in my ear and said, you know, you should call Jihad al-Awali at the Canadian Arab Federation. Ask him about his advice about covering the Middle East. And I didn't know much about the Middle East at that time. And so Bernie introduced me to Jihad. And it was something, a pro tip that I was very grateful for many years. Now, Jihad wasn't the only other stakeholder that Bernie knew. He also reached out to the Canadian Somali Congress. I'm going to mix up Canadian and Congress, but there's the Canadian Somali Congress, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, in addition to the Canadian Arab Federation. And so before intersectionality was a thing and reaching out and allyship, Bernie had thought it up himself decades ago, dating myself here, decades ago, and converted it into action. He was a one-stop shopping. And when I was in the Middle East, he would keep an eye on me, but he never criticized. He just would know he was looking over my shoulder. He was a natural choice, therefore, to take over the Mosaic Institute, which is a kind of amalgam of multiculturalism and brings together Canadians of different backgrounds to try to be a force multiplier. So he was a natural there. And of course, culminated in his role as chair of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, in which he would unite people in tolerance in fighting intolerance. Welcome, Bernie.
Thank you.
I could go on like for more pages, but I think we have work to do. Tema Smith is well known in Canada and in the US as a diversity advocate, writer, and Jewish community builder. She's now the director of Jewish outreach and partnerships for the Anti-Defamation League across the US. She also writes for The Forward, which is a progressive voice on Jewish issues. She's a frequent speaker and trainer on issues of racial equity, diversity, and anti-Semitism. Given her expertise, she was a member of the task force on the Nexus task force that looked hard at coming up with a different definition of anti-Semitism that would stand the test of time and the test of free speech. She's also on the North American Board of Trustees for the Union for Reform Judaism, and she's on the board of the New Israel Fund of Canada, another progressive Jewish organization. Now, I haven't known Tema as long as I've known Bernie because she's not as old as Bernie and me. But she is, as I said, well known in Canada and the US for an impressive body of work. And it's fair to say that, like Bernie, she embodies diversity, outreach, and the fight for human rights across a racial and religious divide. So welcome, Tema.
Thank you.
Okay. So before we begin, more picking up on where Kareem left off, I've moderated some rambunctious political debates. And my goal is always to maintain control and stay on topic, and that's my plan for tonight as well. So I always remind our audience that we're here to hear these folks and not speeches from the floor. If you've come for the panel on Israel's ultra-right, ultra-religious government, I'm afraid you're about 3 months late. I was on that panel somewhere else, so that's not what we're talking about tonight. Sorry you missed it. If you're here and you've come for the debate on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and who's to blame, you're in the wrong room. That seminar is somewhere else. Just go through the elevator or something. We'll show you the way. All that said, it's a public event, and we do encourage a respectful dialogue. So I'll kick it off with an opening round of questions. So start thinking up your own. We'll take a short break and come back with the audience questions. You can submit them online using the chat function as you've heard. So at the end, we'll wrap up with a kind of call to action from both of these folks to tell us what to do once we figure out what we have to do. Okay, so I've told you about our guests. Before we really get going, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about me, because it's an interesting evening for me tonight. You've heard my bio, and it's all about my journalistic career. But the truth is that I identify as a journalist, and I spent a lifetime trying to see things through the eyes of others and tell their stories. But that's just skin deep. The fact is, I am also part of a minority group, whether I'm religious or not, whether I look white or just white passing. I have an identifiably Jewish surname, Cohn, Cohn, depends how you want to transliterate it, which means that when people see my surname, many of them, it colors the way they see me too, whether it's in Canada or when I was based in the Middle East or Asia. And so when we discuss anti-Semitism tonight, it's worth asking, is anti-Semitism a form of racism? Are Jews a race? Because some people say if Jews aren't a race, it can't be racist. It's something else. It's religious intolerance, perhaps. Just remember before we get going that race is a social construct. It's not a scientific concept. And people today often forget that Jews were always historically considered a race, long before the Nazis focused on that and long after the Nazis. And I want to just set the table tonight by asking you to look at a slide. Jillian, if you can put that up. It's from the mid-1950s here in Ontario, and shows the racial restrictions for a summer resort in Lake Huron, just down the highway from Toronto. The lands shall never be sold, leased, rented, or used in any manner by any person of the Jewish, Hebrew, Semitic, Negro, or colored race or blood, covering all possible definitions there. So are Jews a race? I mean, I think the answer is that racists define Jews as a race, which makes Jews racialized. Jillian, if we can put up the next slide. This one shows how racism affected my family, maybe in a small way, in Canada. It's a newspaper clipping from the Montreal Gazette, roughly the same period, early 1950s, same period as the previous slide. It's about my father and mother, new immigrants to Canada. You'll see in the last paragraph that the lawyer for the landlord, when he found out that my parents were Jewish, said that he was sorry, but the other tenants did not want Jewish couples to occupy the same building. So, what exactly is anti-Semitism? I've given you a couple of examples. Better question is, how do we fight hate? So I've tried to set the table a little bit. Bernie, you have written a lot about how some people get hung up on definitions of anti-Semitism and sometimes go down rabbit holes trying to figure out, parse the exact language of anti-Semitism definitions and so on. So my question to you is, I noticed a long time ago that you call it sometimes Jew hatred, just Jew hatred. Forget anti-Semitism and semantics and so on and so forth. Are they one and the same thing?
In many ways they are. I think we have to remember that anti-Semitism was coined almost as a scientific term in Germany in the late 1800s, Antisemitismus, as there was a sense of providing kind of a scientific explanation for the hatred of Jews. But when it comes down to it, It is hatred of truth. It's true hatred. But here's the thing in the 21st century or 2023. Like every other group, we have been struggling to try and figure out what defines anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism? And so, like every other group, except Jews are probably 10 times more on when it comes to this, we have not one, not two, not three, but 4 or 5 definitions of anti-Semitism. Probably the most significant of which, and the most widely accepted amongst the leadership groups in North America and around Europe, is the so-called IRA definition, the International Holocaust definition. It is, by the way, not a bad definition. There are certain issues with the definition when it comes to how Israel is viewed, but it's pretty hard to separate Israel, which is for all intents and purposes a Jewish state, from anti-Semitism.
Let me bring in Tema here on this topic before we dig in a little deeper, without going into the rabbit hole. We have so much ground to cover. Tema, tell us about some of those other definitions, just briefly. We're not gonna put them on the screen and so on. But why are there? How many are there? And you've been involved, I think, in one of them. But what's the differences between, just briefly?
Sure. So, very briefly stated, the IHRA definition or the IRA definition is, as Bernie just said, the most widely accepted by government agencies, universities, et cetera, et cetera. It was put together by a couple of scholars at the IHRA, which is a membership-based organization of, I've lost track of the number of countries that belong, but at one point it was 26. I think that might still be the right number. Where governments of the countries actually sent delegates, and that's who had adopted it. So it was already sort of a very high-level government type, but crucially non-legally binding definition. There are sort of, at least in the US, where I primarily work, 2, I will call them competing, I use that a little bit loosely, definitions. So there's the Nexus document, which is what I worked on, that was meant to elaborate some of the issues that are either left vague or unclear within the IRA definition. So it's meant as a complement. It's meant to be read alongside it to help sort of work out any nuance or unclarity. And then there's the Jerusalem Declaration, which is that sort of branded itself as a response to. I agree that the IRA definition is actually a relatively good definition. And for the sake of an educational tool, it's very, very useful. And one of the things that makes it useful is the fact that because it is widely adopted, people are working from the same framework. That was the point of that definition.
It's not legally binding.
It is not.
And when you say IRA, IHRA, that stands for International Holocaust Remembrance Association
Alliance. So
Alliance.
it used to be called the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Remembrance, Education, and Research. I'm sure you can all guess why they might have changed that name. But we used to call it the ITF, which it turns out if you Google ITF is the International Tennis Federation.
But there are these definitions, different definitions, because people started to challenge, well, can you criticize Israel or not? Can you be critical of Zionism or not? We're not going to go down those rabbit holes. That's another seminar.
Other than to say that, and Tim was quite right, the IRA definition is a stable definition, but it is not legally binding. So in other words, it should not and cannot be used to attack and to use in the legal framework.
And one additional piece that
It's guidance.
It's good.
it's guidance, and I think one additional piece is that the IRA definition itself is actually in 2 parts. There's the definition, and then there's examples. And actually, Israel is not mentioned in the definition. Israel is mentioned in the examples, and that happened for a very specific reason. You know, if somebody commits an overt act of anti-Semitism, you know, you whatever Jew, it's obvious. But diving into some of the nuance of like, okay, well, actually, somebody criticized Israel. Was that anti-Semitic or not? Needed a little bit more unpacking. And so that's why those examples are there. But I think there's an over focus now on the examples rather than the definition.
And that's why I wanted to raise it and try to park it.
I'm with you.
Because because it's too easy to get bogged down on that. I spent 4 years covering.
Although I would
the
like to
Middle
say
East.
one thing.
Before you do, I spent 4 years covering the Middle East, and it would take 4 years more to try to parse some of the problems and nuances. But often feel it's a bit of a red herring, in that people will say that there's so much Jew hatred out there that let's not focus on that element of it. But go ahead.
My colleague, Len Rudner, and I do workshops for teachers, educators, administrators. We have our own definition that we use, and it's pretty simple. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy about the Jews. And if you think of anything that deals with Jew hatred, whether it's Holocaust denial, Holocaust minimization, Jew hatred of any kind, blood libels, it all comes back down to this concept of a conspiracy, which is, by the way, one of the reasons it's gaining so much popularity again today.
Conspiracies are back.
It's back.
So I think the point we were trying to make here collectively is that no mystery, yes, it is possible to criticize Israel and not be anti-Semitic.
Absolutely.
So that's we've all done it, and it's that taboo has been broken. Okay, my more serious question to you, Bernie, is in your work, how do you focus on fighting on that hate here at home and not getting sidetracked on fighting in the Middle East?
Well, it all depends on how you can bring allies into your fight with you. My experience has been that for many years, Jews have fought the battle of anti-Semitism alone. Now, we were pretty good at it because, it is known as the longest hatred, and we've had lots of experience in terms of dealing with it. But the fact is that, people I think in their heads define it as a Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It's actually much more a non-Jewish problem. And so, we try to work with other allies, with police and with others in terms of identifying and defending and protecting and creating, if you will, a fence of protection. So what do I mean by that in a nutshell? The problem is it's not against the law in this country to be an anti-Semite. Not against the law to be a racist. You can be a homophobe, and you can be an Islamophobe. That's not against the law. But unlike in the United States and other places, we actually do have specific law in this country against hatred. And it is the spreading of that hatred that becomes the issue, right? So it is, under Section 319 of the Criminal Code, a criminally indictable offense to knowingly and willfully promote hatred against an identifiable group identified by race, creed, color, nationality, sexual orientation. The problem here is that once you codify something like this, which is so amorphous, you have to have specially trained police officers who understand what they're doing when they're dealing with hate. It's not like a bank robbery, right? When someone robs a bank, there's a bad guy, you go in and get them, that's it. Hatred is thoughts, and you're going to have a special kind of training. So, in many police services across the continent, you have a homicide squad, you have a bicycle theft squad, you have all kinds of squads. We used to have an anti-hate squad in most urban police services across this country. When the law first came out in the early 70s, the police did find, they thought to themselves, we have to have something here in order for our officers to understand where they're going. So they had anti-hate squads, and they did actually quite well. They understood it, they went out to schools, they spoke, and they made arrests. Problem is, as the world changed, so did the policing. And these anti-hate squads now, although many police services will tell you, oh yeah, we still have anti-hate squads, they don't. They have an intelligence officer or two that becomes the expert on hate altogether. It's not good enough. With the proliferation now, and not just of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, we've always been in the top three. But really, if you take a look outside now, 2 LGBTQ plus young people have become incredibly harsh targets by a group of conspiracy nutbars and others. And we are seeing schools being taken over and all kinds of other things. So when I talk about allyship and when I talk about anti-Semitism, I also have to talk about homophobia and Islamophobia. I mean, there are strength in numbers, but the only way to deal with anti-Semitism, in my view, is to deal with the other phobias as well, as work closely together.
So let's pick up on that thread and go to Tema here. So tonight's talk on anti-Semitism is part of a series, an anti-racism series that's being put on by the Dais here on campus. But anti-Semitism, as Bernie pointed out, it is the oldest, perhaps, or most documented, or one of the first forms of prejudice and discrimination. And as one of the oldest, it sometimes seems like old news, in the sense that it's not new. It's not like the LGBTQ plus 2SL or other elements that you're talking about, and an increased consciousness on indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, and so on. There was a headline in the papers a couple of years ago that talked about how Toronto had seen an unprecedented spike in hate crimes. Kareem actually referred to it, but that headline pointed out that Toronto saw an unprecedented spike that included a rise in anti-Asian and anti-Black incidents, according to police. But only further down in the story did it say that although Jewish people represent only 3.8% of Toronto's population, it saw 30% of the hate crimes, by far the most. So are they less newsworthy because of the historic association? And I guess the question, Tema, with that long preamble, is how is anti-Semitism different from other forms of racism? I think you call it punching up versus punching down. People who are perceived to be powerful and privileged versus underprivileged and powerless. So talk about those different kinds of racism for a moment.
Sure. So I think on a basic level, Bernie covered part of it by saying, anti-Semitism is a rumor about the Jews or a conspiracy theory about the Jews. Anti-Semitism functions very, very differently than other forms of racism. And I'm going to use a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. Let's go back to 1930s Berlin. They, of course, were virulently anti-everything. But thinking of, people may have seen Cabaret, the musical Cabaret. Jews were blamed for, quote, sexual deviance. We see stuff like that show up quite regularly, where the same people who are attacking LGBTQ communities are virulently anti-Semitic. I'll use a more recent example. The top supermarket shooting in Buffalo just a little over a year ago, or the mosque shooter in New Zealand. I nearly said Newfoundland. I'm like, that is not the right place. In New Zealand a number of years ago, both had anti-Semitic manifestos blaming Jews for the influxes of populations, for the social issues in Black communities. The gentleman who shot up the Tree of Life synagogue, who recently was sentenced in that crime, targeted the synagogue because of the work of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and what he said were George Soros funded open border projects. So you can see that while anti-immigrant, xenophobic, racist, everything is part of ideologies here, a lot of how you can recognize the difference in how this works is that Jews get blamed for everything else. So Jews essentially become the scapegoats.
Punching bag, as it were. Tell me about the punching up and punching down, though.
Sure. So when for folks who take this conspiracist view of anti-Semitism, and people who don't knowingly take that view, since all anti-Semitism kind of wades in that pool, it is seen as acting out against power. And that's what makes it really interesting to talk about in an anti-racist context, is because sometimes you're looking at people who are using language that would be accepted in talking about other racisms and phobias to talk about what the Jews do. And so unless you're really sort of well-versed in understanding those tropes, and I could go on about tropes for hours, like I sometimes do in trainings, unless you're well-versed in those tropes, it actually seems like people are maybe doing social justice work when what they're actually doing is anti-Semitism. And that makes it very challenging to tackle, because why wouldn't you want to push back against power? But the idea that Jews are powerful is, of course, anti-Semitism trap, probably number one.
2017 in Charlottesville.
Mhm. Yes.
There was a march of neo-Nazis and white supremacists. They passed down through the main street and the largest synagogue in Charlottesville. Now they approached the synagogue. They started screaming at the top of their lungs. I have this on video clip. They first started saying, "They will not replace us." And as they come close to the synagogue, you hear them all chant in unison, "Jews will not replace us." So what are they talking about? This goes right back to what we were saying. This concept of a replacement theory. Americans, Canadians, and Europeans have this concept that it's the big bad Jews, of course, that are trying to reconstruct society by bringing immigrants in and replacing the good old Americans and taking away their jobs. This has been a consistent, a constant anti-Semitic trope and refrain that goes back literally generations. So everything old when it comes to anti-Semitism is actually new again.
But what's changed, I think, is that when you were younger, you would get, I suspect, have a sleepless night if you would see people handing out leaflets at a subway station or or holding a meeting at a country club that were anti-Semitic. That almost seems quaint now when you think about how the internet is a force multiplier for these conspiracy theories. So how has that changed?
It's not different. It's not different. It's just exponentially increased it, right? And you're right. I used to tell people, like, the anti-Semites, Nazis, they used to hang out here at Young and Bloor or at Young College or at Young and Dundas. They would hand out their papers, right? 10 people took their papers. That was considered a really good day for them. Today, all you have to do is sit with your laptop or your iPad and type out a few messages, press a key onto a website, onto social media, and potentially, hundreds of thousands of people can see those hateful, disgusting messages. Out of those hundreds of thousands of people, how many do you need to create havoc? How many do you need to really promote this hatred? Well, let's say 5,000. And out of those 5,000, how many are really like gung-ho about it? Let's say a few hundred. And out of those few hundred, how many would actually go onto the streets and cause harm to Jewish people or to people of color? I don't know, 20. And of those 20, how many of them are Alexander Bissonnette? Or how many of them are Robert Bauer? Alexander Bissonnette was a man who walked into a mosque in Quebec City and murdered 6 Muslims peacefully at prayer. Robert Bowers was the one that Tema referred to, walked into the synagogue in Pittsburgh and murdered 11 Jews on their Sabbath peacefully at prayer. It only takes one. And today we have a tool. A tool is a wonderful tool, but it's also a very dangerous tool. A tool that can be used to promote and to coagulate hatred. And it does it sadly very well.
Bernie, you are a part of the federal government's expert advisory group on online safety. Tell us what you heard, and tell us what you want done, and tell us why it hasn't happened.
Well, it hasn't happened because there's way too much resistance to anything that even has that slight scent of control, of limiting speech. But the fact of the matter is that we can go on. And I'm telling you guys, as sure as we are sitting here today, and it may not be tomorrow, and it may not be next week, or it may be as I walk out of this building, there will be an anti-Semitic or hate attack in this city without question. It's going to happen. And it's going to happen exactly because of social media, because they've been indoctrinated by social media. So unless we are able to get that under some control, and I know people hate this concept of social media control. It should be this free and open space, et cetera, et cetera. But people are dying. People are being murdered. They're being killed. We have to have some form of rules. It's not a wild, wild west. We have to have some form of rules. We already have that written into law.
Other countries have done this.
Australia has tried. Germany has tried. They're not having a great deal of success, but at least it's there. At least they have something that they can play with. Canada has taken, well, I sat on this commission 2 years ago, We handed in our report a year ago, last summer.
Right.
We're still waiting for even a peep. And if it's not gonna happen with this particular government, if there's a new government that comes in that's, let's say, a little bit more retrograde, it's certainly not gonna happen.
Okay, I think we'll circle back when we open it up to questions from the floor. Before we take a quick break, I just want to throw a question at Tema. You, I think, one of your responsibilities at the Anti-Defamation League is Jewish outreach. Talk to me about other kinds of outreach across the racial and religious divide and how that helps with Jewish outreach in terms of the fight against anti-Semitism.
Sure. Before I do, just want to add one teeny piece to Bernie's comments on social media. The problem isn't even so much, the idea of censoring social media in some way, shape, or form. The problem is getting social media to enforce their own policies. I think that, I could go down a long rabbit hole about this one, but many people may have seen last month, the owner of the site formerly known as Twitter, X, amplified a white nationalist hashtag against the organization that I work for, and that was picked up with white nationalists marching in Florida and other places, leafleting. It still happens quite widely. The distribution of hateful leaflets, and this is the owner of the platform is amplifying. We give out a social media report card every year. Holocaust denial, so on and so forth, other hateful content is rampant on all of the platforms. This isn't specific to one. But I'll talk a little bit about the sort of cross-communal work. ADL stands as a member of the LCCHR, the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights Organizations. But more importantly, we were actually founded in 1913 with a dual mission to fight the defamation of the Jewish people. I say definitions too much, and secure justice and fair treatment for all. Those two sides of the coin. And you can imagine in 1913, that was actually fairly radical to fight an organization when you were fighting for your rights that said, actually, ours have to go alongside other folks. And I think it's really important to remember that so much of when we see hatred rise is when we see democracy in the lurch, when we see democracy falter, when there's threats against the institutions that we feel keep us safe. And so really, that is, I hate using the language where Jews are sort of a canary in the coal mine. I actually really don't like that language, but because of the conspiracist nature of things, often rising anti-Semitism is the first sign that things are about to get a lot worse for a lot. So I'm a very firm believer, and we've sort of spoken about this a little bit already, that you need to reach out to other communities who are targeted. Anti-Semitism isn't a Jewish problem. It is a problem that Jews have to live with, but it's not on us to solve. And likewise, reaching out to other communities to say, how can we show up to help solve the hatreds that are targeting you is so crucial. I'll give you one example of how we do it. And this is speaking specifically to the Jewish Outreach and Partnerships team at ADL. Under my leadership last year, we launched a synagogue engagement initiative. I haven't checked the numbers for cohort 2 in the last few days, but we're going to have over 200 congregations across Canada and the US who basically put up their hands and say, we want to do something. And during the year, they have to do one program educating themselves on how anti-Semitism functions, and one program or initiative that we call a community initiative. And most of what we encourage them to do is reach out across lines of difference, whether it's to find an issue that impacts themselves and the Black church down the street or the mosque down the street, and actually approach their city council or their school board or their congressperson about it, or to do community building work. So for example, the synagogue I belong to here for a very long time has had a relationship with a mosque, and the youth in the Bar Mitzvah program learn from the youth at the mosque and vice versa. And we've seen the power of that relationship when things happen. So I remember participating in Ring of Peace. There were, I think, 7 different rings of peace after the mosque shooting in Quebec, where members of synagogues all went when the Muslim community was at prayer on Friday and actually just stood outside to create like a human shield and sang songs of peace during their services. And when Pittsburgh happened, they came to us. And those relationships are so important. Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker, who was held hostage recently in Colleyville, Texas, was actually my first official on staff call at ADL was while he was being held hostage. So it's very like that tells you a lot about how close anti-Semitism can hit. And one thing I will add on that is when the news report popped up, I did what probably many people who work in the Jewish community did, and went to look at his Facebook to see how many people we knew in common. And we had all sorts of friends in common. So it like, here it is in Texas, a guy I've never met, but he is part of my community. One of my mentors was who the hostage taker demanded to call, Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, is very close knit. And so it hits very close to home. But Rabbi Charlie keeps talking about how while he was in there, the pastor he developed a relationship with, the imam he had developed a relationship, were standing just behind the police line, basically calming people down, working together, praying, so on and so forth. And that he really felt it inside, knowing that when he knew that they were there. And so that is so important. I'm sure there's going to be great questions, so I'm not going to keep talking on this. But I think the reality is with rising hate, we are just better in community. And so whatever that
and
looks like,
there is reciprocity.
there is reciprocity. There needs to be. I think that there is some, there needs to be more. And, you know, I'll talk about, I can mention a specific instance where I think a lot of the Jewish community struggled was in, it was May 21, when there was, when Israel and Hamas were engaged in another violent conflict, anti-Semitism skyrocketed. When I say skyrocketed, I mean like random Jews out for dinner were being physically attacked. And so many of the interfaith partnerships broke down. I know people who, I know a woman who is herself an anti-racism educator inside the Jewish community, who was forced to step out of her job when she posted something on social media expressing concern for her family who were there. And just the sense of abandonment in that moment. I don't know what the politics of people eating dinner were, and that shouldn't matter at the end of the day. If they're sitting around a table having dinner on a weeknight.
They were attacked for being Jews.
They were attacked for being Jews.
So the reciprocity broke down.
Absolutely broke down. And that is why I think
There was a similar situation, not as violent, but down in Thornhill. During that exact same period, a group of Palestinian protesters, and I get it. I mean, you know, this is war and they want to get their message across. But instead of going in front of the Israeli consulate, which is where that message should be sent, they came to a little plaza, some Bathurst and Chabad Gate, in the middle of literally Jewish Thornhill, the largest Jewish populated area in Canada, to demonstrate. And what is in that plaza? There is a kosher bakery, there's a vegetable store, there's a store called Taste of Israel, there's another kosher restaurant. This is a Jewish place. So they weren't coming to protest what was politically happening in the Middle East. They were coming to protest against Jews. And that is, when we talk about when does it come together, when that is an example when it does come together. That was anti-Semitism.
Okay, we'll take a very short break, look at some more of the questions we have, and we will be back very shortly and follow up on this thread.
Hard thing.
anticipated the theme we were just discussing. And his question is, do you sense that other communities and organizations committed to combating racism recognize Jews as also being targets of racism? So let me just amplify that question by picking up on what you were saying. So if I heard you correctly, the faith leaders and other allies of who lead organizations are there on the front lines or literally on the police lines when there's an attack, supporting Jews and Jewish organizations or synagogues when they come under attack as a kind of reciprocity or part of the relationship. What about the broader communities, though? I mean, you both spoke about some of the fracture points, but is there a distinction between the faith leaders and the broader communities that are slower to come round? And what do you do to change that? Either one of you, Bernie, Tema?
I'll jump in. First of all, hi Meyer, I assume that you're on Zoom somewhere. No, I think that anti-Semitism is very poorly understood at large. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. But some of it goes right back to that whole punching up versus punching down. Is that for folks who are not really in the know, you look out and you see the Jewish community, fairly prominent voices within the community, well established, lots of professors, lots of doctors, whatever you might like to sort of point at as signs of success. And then on the additional piece of this, and I've written a lot about this in an American context, so it is slightly different here. I write as somebody who is mixed race myself, so I've been really fascinated with the question of are Jews white, which is a really complicated question, and I've written thoughts on it, and I'm not going to talk about what I've written, but Eric Ward, who is one of the leading sort of analysts of white nationalism in the US, who himself is a Black man, he's now the executive vice president of an organization called Race Forward, has written a few different pieces, and one of them is called The Evolution of Identity Politics. It was an interview with him. And he talks actually very directly to how this lack of understanding of Jews, first of all, having been racialized through history, but also not necessarily being fully welcomed into whiteness by people who still want to racialize Jews. Talks about this idea that Jews being sort of reduced to whiteness has made it almost impossible, since he dates it to about the late 60s, early 70s, for Jews to talk about anti-Semitism in ways that are coherent. And I hear this, by the way, within the Jewish community as well, where I hear Jews who are very engaged in social justice work say, well, like, we're doing pretty well here, like, we're doing great. And in the meantime, these other communities are being targeted with racism and other forms of often violent persecution. And the reality is, I think we have to fight all of it at the same time, and we need to educate ourselves as Jewish community, as well as people outside, that anti-Semitism didn't end with the Holocaust. That's not sort of there's sort of a neat redemption story that people like to tell, which is that the Holocaust happened, Canada and the US let immigrants in, and then the Jewish community worked their way up and are now very successful white people like anyone else. The stats just don't bear that out. And I think I'm going to point to Eric again. He says in this really brilliant way that Jews have been conditionally granted access to whiteness, where Jews are allowed to play part of sort of majority culture as long as we don't come across or talk too much about being Jewish. And he says, like, that's not, that kind of tells you that, Jewish whiteness might be a little bit of a question mark. And I think that is another double-edged sword when we're talking about anti-Semitism, anti-racism, is that because of access to power, access to majority institutions, whatever it might be, there is concern about not being too loud about anti-Semitism, as on one hand, and then also looking at the issues that other communities face and saying, well, we don't have it like that. I firmly believe that you can fight against all of it at the same time. That's what I've tried to spend my career doing, and hope to continue to spend my career doing.
Part of the problem is the paradigm or the prism of privilege, which is a word that's used today. A useful word, but also perhaps it can blind people to the fact that privilege isn't permanent. It's not irreversible. I was struck as a journalist reading about a couple of court cases involving two very prominent Muslim Canadians. Walid Solomon, who is chair of Norton Rose Fulbright, I think, and Mohammed Faki, who's the founder and head of Paramount Foods, both were tormented by Islamophobia, by vicious anti-Muslim hate. And they went to court to silence their critics using hate laws and other defamation laws, I should say. It got no coverage. It got no ink. They won, but the story didn't go anywhere because journalists didn't find it that interesting that these powerful, successful Muslims had been persecuted and had fought back successfully. It wasn't an interesting story because, well, they're so powerful and successful. How could it be? How could it be a story of persecution? And so, just like Jews sometimes face, because they've been in North America for many of them for a long time, sometimes face this paradigm of, well, how can you possibly be persecuted if you're privileged?
Yet on the same hand, though, Martin, a swastika on a synagogue will still get a picture in first 3 pages of the Toronto Star, as it probably should. But if I can give you an example, it's a short story.
Swastika is understandable.
Exactly.
Yes.
But if I give you a sort of short story that maybe it illustrates this a little bit better, I was working with a school board that shall remain nameless. And they were going through anti-Black training in terms of understanding anti-racism, colonialism, suppression. And my job was to do anti-Semitism. At one point, one of the Jewish teachers came up to me and said, well, in our workshop on anti-racism, the instructor was telling us about white supremacy, and that we all have to take responsibility for white supremacy, that we're all part of a white supremacist culture. And then she made us go around, each of us, and say, we are part of a white supremacist culture. Said to me, and I couldn't do it because I'm Jewish. My father, survived Auschwitz. I'll be damned if I'm going to say I'm part of a white supremacist culture. And that led to an entire mishigas, which is Latin for craziness, in which I worked with the school board in trying to find a proper definition for white supremacy. And can Jews be victims of white supremacy while at the same time be part of a white supremacist culture? And it's a fascinating and very, very complex question.
So there was sometimes this sounds very abstract, the issue of anti-Semitism, but there has been persistent allegations and concerns of anti-Semitism at the University of Toronto School of Medicine, Temerity Faculty of Medicine. And they had an investigator who wrote an academic paper, a peer-reviewed paper in the Canadian Education Journal about the problem at U of T. And one of the most interesting manifestations of this anti-Jewish paranoia, another word for anti-Semitism, the conspiracy theories we're talking about, is that so many people on campus, professors and students, medical students, pretty smart folks, wanted to know why this awareness of anti-Semitism was being forced upon them by the founder of the medical school, this Temerity guy. It turns out that James Temerity, the donor after whom the school is named, is not Jewish, but the conspiracy took root
Interestingly
anyway.
enough, he's a Ukrainian Canadian, very active in the Ukrainian Canadian community.
So the investigator wrote about how the other problem, to Tema's point, is that when first year medical students were asked to fill out documentation or surveys on ethnic origin and whether they felt marginalized or victim or racialized, there was no entry for Jews. So there's this inability, she writes, to accept Jews as victims of discrimination because of an inaccurate but pervasive belief in Jewish whiteness. So first year medical students are taught that race is a social, not a biological construct, And yet, there's no other way to explain the expression.
Well, here, actually here at Metropolitan University, when it was called Ryerson University, it's about 2 or 3 years ago, they had a beautiful ad campaign, and I don't know if some of you will remember this, where they listed every single one of the isms: homophobia, racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, you name it, they were all listed there, but guess which one was missing?
Mhm.
Anti-Semitism. And I don't subscribe to the theory that this was done on purpose. They just didn't think about it. It just didn't enter their construct, right?
And I would say that that is more commonly the case. It's not that somebody went, oh, anti-Semitism, and somebody said, no, 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 they're privileged.
Exactly.
It just that notion that Jews are privileged and therefore not the victims of prejudice, racialization, hate, etc., is so ingrained because of the ways that anti-Semitism work. You can kind of see this like circularity of it, that the conspiracy about Jewish power is so deeply ingrained that it becomes sort of a loop. I'll talk more about this when it gets to sort of our action items, but I really think that anti-Semitism is just so poorly understood that for the most part, most anti-Semitism that I see day to day, ignoring the sort of more egregious examples that Bernie and I have both spoken about tonight, is just absolute ignorance. I was just thinking of a specific example also related to this school. My mom went back to social work school when I was a kid. And here at TMU, formerly known as Ryerson. And she has told me over and over again that she was told in sort of the anti-oppression lenses that she had no right to speak as somebody who had never experienced oppression. Now, she grew up in Toronto through the 50s and 60s, where she couldn't go to her classmates' birthday parties because they were at restricted clubs. And having to say the Lord's Prayer in school every morning at public school. And then at this moment in time also was raising 2 mixed race kids. And at the time my father was working for Metro as in the, I think at that point it was probably Access and Equity. It changed names a handful of times. But this is somebody who was very well steeped in it.
Your father, Charles Smith.
My father, Charles Smith, yes. And who knows Bernie from back in the day, so it's very funny to be on the panel. When they would do sort of breakouts to talk about experiences, she was always told to go with the white group. And she was like, no, like you don't people actively like their parents maybe because she was older, actively were part of like persecuting me as a child and to today. And I think we sort of distance ourselves from it and say, oh, that was then. But it always fascinates me to look at how we look at other inequities, maybe from the 50s and 60s, and point to how they've become systemic in different ways. But for some reason, we haven't been able to make that jump with anti-Semitism.
Okay, so 2 points. One, Bernie, because you complained about how anti-Semitism was ignored by then Ryerson, now TMU, that's why you're here tonight.
No, they didn't ignore it.
To make up for that. And secondly, to Tema and Bernie Poe, here's a question from an audience member that maybe addresses the confusion and the contradictions that you're talking about in terms of the anti-oppression lens. Would it be more helpful to stop referring to anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, different words for the same issue or similar issue, and just refer to discrimination of everyone, both from a definitional standpoint and from a solutions standpoint? Prejudice, persecution of all groups wrongly, rather than just this ism or that phobia.
The only problem I see with that, and I've actually written about this and given this thought over many years, because there are threads of hatred that run through everything. And what we're dealing today with today, and I will get to this in our conclusion, the hatred against trans folks and trans kids and to LGBTQ is so dangerous and so pervasive, and has been so separated out as to make them the targets of hatred, that how how good would it be to say, okay, we're all kind of together on the same boat, and it's called discrimination. But it ignores one, I think, really important factor, and that's history. And without history, we are nobody. We've seen that just this past week. With this issue of the Waffen SS man that was glorified in Parliament. We are an ahistorical country. And I remember I was sitting with my wife and we were watching President Zelensky's speech. And all of a sudden the speaker gets up and says, I want to introduce this Ukrainian hero, this fighting against the Soviets from 1941, 1945. Turned to Karen and said, in 1941-45, fighting against the Soviets, he was a Nazi. And all 300 people stood up and applauded this man who was a member of the Waffen SS. Now, if we're talking about history, the Waffen SS murdered my entire paternal family. My father was the only survivor of a small Polish village, the only Jewish survivor. And they were murdered in Treblinka death camp by the Waffen SS. And here in this country, in my House of Parliament, this shameful act occurred. Why? Exactly what you said, ignorance.
If Erwin Collar had
Ignorance.
still been an MP, perhaps he could have raised it.
Perhaps he could have, or maybe he would have stood up. I tend to doubt it. I tend to
I think
doubt
the same.
But that's what I'm trying to say. I mean,
same
we
way,
have to
yeah.
have a sense of history and each of our histories to understand where the hate comes from. But I still believe that the threads can be woven together in order to defend and protect and create what I call that fence of protection.
I just want to add one piece to it, which I talk a lot about understanding the different hatreds as part of a broader system of oppression, but it doesn't always show up as discrimination. I think that's another piece of it, is that hatred can take all sorts of forms. And, sometimes I get asked to talk about including anti-Semitism in like DEI work. And I've spoken a lot about that a lot of the focus, rightfully so, in DEI has been on equity. Well, if you look at Jews in many workplaces, Jews are not an equity-seeking group in many workplaces. However, they are part of the other parts of the equation. So there isn't necessarily employment discrimination against Jews. However, anti-Semitism may still be present. And so I think the systems of oppression function in all sorts of different ways. Discrimination is one piece of that, but it's not the only piece. And so to flatten it to sort of just that one piece, I think leaves us possibly able to recognize some things, but much less able to recognize other things. And I think that likely is more true of anti-Semitism than some of the other hatreds because of that punching phenomenon.
A couple of quick questions, audience questions I want to ask that you've mentioned a couple of times your American experience. Kind of quickly, just without going into extensive detail, differences between American and Canadian, or more specifically, do you feel that what do you feel about anti-Semitism creeping into Canada from the US, if that is the case?
So I'll let Bernie speak more to hate networks in Canada, but I think we like to say that. I don't think that's true for any number of reasons, but there are active white supremacist networks in Canada and have been for a long time. I mentioned that Bernie knew my dad. That was from the good old days of Brent Zundel and the Heritage Front operating in Toronto. And like everyone probably knows Sneaky D's at the corner of College and Bathurst. Like I grew up knowing it as the site of the great anti-racist action Heritage Front punching match in the middle of the intersection. And I sort of joke with it. I think actually my Canadian Jewish friends were less surprised with the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism south of the border after 2016 than my American Jewish friends were, which says a lot about the climate here. And just to sort of really drive it home again, I grew up downtown Toronto, actually walking distance from here. My grandma worked in the atrium. Going to Queen West, and my mom told me or taught me which color shoelace in the Doc Martens were the safe people and which color shoelaces in the Doc Martens were the unsafe people in the 80s. here in Toronto. This is not, we like to sort of paint ourselves as like this nice, friendly country north of the border. That's not unfortunately the case. I can point to all sorts of examples, but you know, I'll just say the founder of the Proud Boys is Canadian.
Absolutely, and remember, the largest purveyor of anti-Semitic Holocaust denial material in the world was Ernst Zumwalt.
Yes.
Diagolon is, you know, a white supremacist organization that is gaining adherents right across this country and in the United States.
Keep going, Bernie, because there's two questions that fold into this. I'm gonna marry them or read them both.
Okay.
Do you think online anti-Semitism will get worse before it gets better? And what changes would need to happen for things to improve? Or is there any cause for optimism? And related question, as social media users, how should we, everyone, respond to misinformation and hateful comments online?
Let me just deal with one. Is there any cause for optimism? I don't mean to be a downer on this, but there is no cause for optimism. There just is not, because
Ask and
nobody
answer.
is doing anything.
So then what can you do as it proliferates? What
Well-
if you're a consumer of social media, if you're on it, what do you do when you see it?
I think we have to, and you kind of mentioned, we have to hold the large social media sites accountable. We have to hold X accountable. We have to hold Facebook accountable. We have to hold Telegram accountable. And when I say we, yeah, individuals to the most part, but I'm talking about governments. Governments have to start doing serious work. They have to start finding them if they have to in large dollar amounts, not a couple $1,000, which will just put a dent in their, you know, their pocket. And until that happens, this is going to continue to grow and to fester. And my fear is that we're going to see violence and more violence emanating out of the kind of garbage that we see online. It truly worries me.
So another question from two different people that I'm going to kind of converge again. How come we don't hear about anti-Semitism at work? And what are employers doing? How does AI and the swaths of misinformation and hate speech on the internet come together? What policy is there to address this? What can be done? And a third element. So there's employers. How bad is it? What's being done? And Tema, you've talked about this. So I want to ask this, Paul, before I lose this question. What are schools doing to diversify their holiday and other cultural celebrations? So employers, schools, where are we at?
Okay, so I will start with employers. You know, I think that not enough is being done across the board, frankly. I think that anti-Semitism being included in anti-oppression DEI training is absolutely crucial, but it needs to be done well. It can't just be, this is one of the challenges is, you know, you're trying to slot in, you know, anti-Semitism in a 10-minute slot. And it's very hard to understand the sort of conspiratorial aspect of anti-Semitism in that teeny little slice. I'm trying to, while we're here, look up some information about specifically the algorithm piece, because we have a Center for Technology and Society at ADL that does research on this. And not to sort of parrot what Bernie said, but no, there's no cause for optimism here. AI is, suffice it to say, we just released a report last month called From Bad to Worse, Amplification and Auto-Generation of Hate. That is about, we did a study as well as the Tech Transparency Project, talked about AI and algorithmic amplification of hate. I don't know how many people spend time on TikTok, for example, but lately I'm sure you can imagine that this is my day job. So like I try to go on TikTok to watch dance challenges and cute animal videos. And lately I've been getting served like viciously transphobic content, which I have no idea what I watched for too long to get there. But it doesn't take.
That algorithm could be incriminating. Like we have to see what your pathway
Yeah,
is.
exactly. Yeah. It's actually fascinating to me. My guess is probably watching that. I was watching commentary on the trucker convoy, but it doesn't actually pick up. It picks up keywords, right? So I think that's how I got there.
For sure.
Which is very funny to think that, oh, I was watching somebody pointing out what was going on and somehow have now been getting served progressively more hateful content, which is kind of, I'm an educated consumer who can see it for what it is very quickly. There are a lot of folks on these sites who are not, and I basically don't use social media anymore.
So is that the prescription? Get off social media, and is that realistic?
It's not realistic. And that's the sad thing is I use Instagram to show people pictures of my dog, like woohoo. But I don't need social media for connection anymore.
For the record, I'm not on TikTok, but I am on Instagram, and it has now, as you know, copied the same algorithm and videos,
Yes.
and all of my supplied videos are kitty porn, kitty as a cat porn. So I can say that my hands are clean. It's all cats and some dogs.
I get some of those too, which is great.
So
I'm also cooking videos.
And here's the irony. I am a very proud grandfather of 3 beautiful little boys under the age of 3, but I can't put them on internet, on Instagram or any place else because of the threats to me and my family. I can't expose and revel in these beautiful kids. That's what it does to us. Now, you asked about schools. I think it's an interesting question.
Audience never asked about school.
Yeah. Schools are getting better. We're not where we need to be, but there is a recognition that their administrators, their educators, their teachers have to be trained in what is hate, what is anti-Semitism, how can we deal with it, how do we protect our kids, and they're bringing in people to do this, and it's happening slowly. Here in Toronto, we have a excellent resource in the Toronto Holocaust Museum. But let me make a point, and it's something that I kind of struggle with. Anti-Semitism isn't all the Holocaust. Jewish history isn't all the Holocaust. Jews have been in every piece and particle of this earth. They have been entertainers and sportscasters and book writers and journalists and actors, actresses. We have this tendency within our own community to over concentrate on this horrible tragedy that happened to us. And there's no doubt that we do have to find a way to work that into our consciousness. But at the same time, if that becomes the only thing that identifies us, I think that takes us down a very dark path. I think we also have to speak about the beauty of what Jews have done for Canada and the United States and Great Britain and France and what have you. And that's starting to happen in schools. Not necessarily sort of making pancakes of Hanukkah or whatever, but talking positively about the Jewish experience or the Black experience, as opposed to all the negatives that have always happened.
So I'm gonna have to manage the time because we're almost running out, and I want to save some time for both of you to talk about prescriptions and a path forward after that little glimmer of optimism from you, Bernie. A very quick question, which I'm not going to even let you answer because it's just a really thoughtful observation. In many vulnerable communities, there are those who pass as the majority group, as in white passing, let's say, and some within this actively work against some of these trends work against the community. For example, some gay men being involved in transphobic movements. Are there reasons to believe that such dynamics may also be present within Jewish communities? I think we're out of time, so I'm not going to let you go with that one, but I just think it's interesting that gay men or LGBTQ plus folks will have similar sort of almost invisibility that comes into play. Here's a trick question for you in about 60 seconds, and all the time we have left. It comes from Dr. Philip Berger, who you know is former chief of community medicine at St. Mike's. He asks, answer if you will, in the time I've given you, given the intimate proximity of anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, often indistinguishable, how can anti-Semitism be fought without fighting anti-Zionism? Bernie.
Well, I think, and we don't have the time to do this, but I think we have to define our terms in order to understand what is political and what is and what is Jew hatred. Very often they do come together, as we mentioned, they can come together. More often than not, they don't. It doesn't mean that anti-Zionism is something that shouldn't be dealt with. Yes, it should, in a very difficult political territory right now, and it's what's happening in the Middle East. But I think we have to recognize the fact that, Jew hatred and anti-Zionism, sometimes they hover above and below each other, but there are times that they do come
A
together.
good example on campus might be, this happens at U of T. I've read about it, so it must be true in the papers, that kids will be asked, students will be asked to sign a kind of an anti-Zionism declaration, or that their group is certified as not being.
I was asked to do that. I was participating a few years ago in a social justice community. And they asked us all to sign a form saying that we are not Zionists. And I had to pick myself up and walk out. So, you know, even if I was or wasn't a Zionist, it's an improper question. And it's, as I said, a very complex issue to struggle with. But thank you, Phil, for asking the question.
Okay, here's the last question, which is really more of a segue, because it's a good question, but I think it anticipates what you're both going to talk about, and I'll put Bernie on deck and then Tema after. And the question is, what is one action step? I think you'll have more than one. What is one action step you have for people who would like to be an ally or supportive of an anti-racist or anti-Semitic movement? So Bernie, don't answer the question, you'll answer it with your own final thoughts that you have prepared before.
Okay, so I have a couple of slides if we can look into this, and this may surprise some people here, but what I'm going to look at really is ways to fight hate as opposed to just anti-Semitism. We kind of talked a little bit about this whole issue of bringing them all together. And the issue for me, and I'm kind of shocked that I'm saying this in 2023, that in order to fight hate, can't be afraid to organize. We can't be afraid to protest. And we were talking about organizing and protesting, you know, back in the 40s and 30s and 20s, but we kind of lost our way there. So we have to understand what is the far right. So the next slide. The far right movements are, as you see here, they're loose collections of individuals and organizations working towards anti-democratic goals. And the harbor anti-Semitism, racism, and virtually all other forms of hatred. It's all about them. And the far right has been the biggest threat. You know, a lot of people have asked me, well, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, why is it that you're only concentrating on the far right? Well, first of all, we have a limited scope. We have limited resources. There's 7 people that work for the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and that's it. So we decided that we're going to concentrate on those individuals, those organizations, those groups that attack us and are killing us, literally. That's coming from the extreme right. It's coming from the extreme right. I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about hate. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but very often it does rhyme. Fascism is coming back. Actually, it's really never left us. And we have to find a way to defeat it. People come up to me and say, are you Antifa? Are you Antifa? And I say, yeah. Oh, you're Antifa. I have no clue if they know what they're talking about. I said, yeah, I'm an anti-fascist. My uncle Saul, who fought against the Nazis for the Canadian Armed Forces, guess what? He was an anti-fascist. My father, who fought with the Russian partisans during the war, guess what? He was also an anti-fascist. If you're not anti-fascist, then what are you? Are you pro-fascist? I mean, you have to ask these questions. So in terms of being against anti-Semitism, it's a hatred that we have to confront, all of us together in unison. And we do it by allyship and by standing in solidarity with Jews. It becomes difficult sometimes because Jews are seen as having made it, that they're not in the same kind of jeopardy as others. But the very fact of the matter is that that's not true. We know that not to be true. We're all kind of standing on that same edge of the cliff. And in order to help push us all back, we have to move with each other. We'll organize with anybody. Jewish community will organize with anybody who share our values. Jews are welcome in anti-fascist and anti-hate circles. Not always. They should be welcome in anti-fascist and anti-hate circles without restriction. And sometimes we have to have downright discussions about what those restrictions are and why they're even there. And today the far right is focusing their attacks, and this is really I could get a message across, having spoken to a lot of trans kids in the last 3 or 4 years, the fear amongst that community is overpowering. I remember going to school as a kid in Ottawa. I don't think a day went by that I didn't get a bloody nose because I was a Jew or I didn't suffer from some kind of an anti-Semitic threat. This is now what's happening to 2S LGBTQ plus kids. This is what is happening to them. And in some cases, it's happening with their own parents or conspiracy theorists who are actually attacking schools or coming in front of schools, and they are creating fear in ways I've never seen before. And we have to remember that an attack on one of us is really an attack on all of us. If you move to the next slide. All right, do we going to create the solidarity group? I think that was one back. Yeah. You have to get together with your friends and family and neighbors to form groups of 5 or 6 people to protest together. We have to get back into this mindset of being able to protest and being able to protect our community and to protect our kids. Have to keep each other in the loop and put the call out when it's time to demonstrate. They're coming all over the place. They're coming all over the place. There's always something to do. Go put up posters. Again, we come back to finding your allies. Then, next slide, go confront them. The far right are afraid of being confronted, and I don't mean physically confront them. People say to me, if I'm on the subway and I see a young Muslim woman being harassed, and I see it sadly quite often on the subway, or a young black woman, and it's usually women, almost all the time, put yourself in between them. Be an upstander. You know, there are 3 kinds of people on this earth. There are perpetrators, there are bystanders, of which most of us are, and then there are upstanders. Those are people that actually take the lead and go and do something. And it could be as simple as putting yourself in between the bad guy and the one that's being targeted. We have to be able to do this. If you go onto our site, as you see there, antihate.ca, we have the Pride Defense Guide. Google it. It'll help you be safe and more effective when protesting against the far right. These are dangerous people, but because they're dangerous people does not mean that we don't have an obligation to protect ourselves and to protect our community. Sometimes you need even whistles, water bottles are to help, and I have to wrap up. Lastly, protect our schools. We've seen the alarming number of far right groups that are literally trying to get onto school boards to strike fear into the hearts of young trans kids. Protect your schools. I'm not going to go into the long dissertation there, but you see it. If we don't protect our schools, we have lost. Tema.
Sure. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the policy proposals that my colleagues in the US have put forward that I think translate across the border quite nicely. So we have 3 policy platforms that are sort of our core piece of what we think are policy solutions to fighting not just anti-Semitism, but multiple forms of hate. And one thing I know I didn't speak about during my time, but I think I'll mention now, is that the White House actually released a landmark whole of society approach to fighting anti-Semitism and has put out to the entire US administration that they must have plans to fight the rise of anti-Semitism. It's a 60-some-odd page document. It is, I think, a phenomenal example of policy-based solutions to fighting anti-Semitism. So if anyone's really interested in diving into the weeds of how it can be done through political arms, take a look. I'm going to talk very briefly about our three plans. They're all on ADL's website. So if you just Google ADL and combat, protect, repair, it is an accident that spells CPR, but we like it. So condemn is condemn anti-Semitism. When you see it, say something. Oppose hate and extremism that is driven by anti-Semitism. Make communities safe from anti-Semitism. So that's things like ensuring that there's adequate government funding for physical security for Jewish and other religious communities and racialized communities institutions. Block anti-Semitism online. We've spoken about some of that. act against global anti-Semitism. Canada does have a special envoy, as does the US. I can't remember his exact title, but you know, recognizing this as a global problem, and teach about anti-Semitism. This doesn't just mean through schools, but definitely through schools. And again, as Bernie said, it can't just be Holocaust education. Although I will say that Holocaust education, statistically, in opinion polling about anti-Semitism, people are less likely to have anti-Semitic attitudes if they know anything about the Holocaust, which is fascinating. But also just knowing about Jews and Judaism is super important. Next slide, I'm just going to read through these, but I'm not actually going to editorialize. Protect is prioritize preventing and countering domestic terrorism. That is definitely valid in this country. Resource according to the threat, ensure that the funding is going to the right places to prevent rise in domestic terrorism. Opposing extremists in government service. Canada has, we know, numerous people who espouse white nationalism, who serve in the army, for example. Take domestic terrorism prevention measures, and the complicity of social media in facilitating extremism, and create an independent clearinghouse for online extremist content, someone who's actually tracking it, and target foreign white supremacist terror groups. And then finally, repair, that's my last slide here, is specifically about online, reorient and resource government to be able to actually recognize and fight it, expose platform recklessness, you know, make them enforce their own policies, put people over profit, advocate for targets of hate and harassment, ensure that there's some supports available for people who are targeted, interrupt disinformation, and regulate the platforms. There's like fact sheets and way more information than I can ever go into on our website. But I think all of those policy solutions translate north of the border. And we work closely, especially on the online stuff, with our Canadian counterparts.
Okay, that is all the time we have, but that is a lot of offerings from both of you to think about, and in answer to some of the questions we had about what do you do about all the stuff that we talked about tonight. So it's a call to action going forward. I want to thank our panelists, Bernie Farber, Tema Smith. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, for watching us online. A big shout out to Kamara Chambers and to Tanya Coelho and the entire team at the Dais at Toronto Metropolitan University under the leadership of Kareem Bardisi. Thank you and stay safe, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Martin. And just a few promos about what's coming up. Thank you so much to the three of you for a really great conversation. We are recording these, and obviously there's an online audience as well as an in-person audience, and we're preparing to really put the 5 talks in this series together in some sort of set of insights, because it's really important to have the differences laid out and have the commonalities laid out. And I think what I found really valuable about this talk is about how much Tema, you and Bernie participate in the broader conversation and really add some richness. We have added so much richness about our understanding of these issues in relation to related issues that we care about at the Dais. Our next talks are Tuesday, October 17th at 6 p.m. That's for me in Brampton, as well as online, Governing Islamophobia, Hate Speech Online, Islamophobic, rather, Hate Speech Online. On Wednesday the 1st, Anti-Black Hate Online. That conversation will be taking place here. And environmental racism in Indigenous communities taking place again here on Tuesday the 14th. Also for online and in-person audience, our Dais fellow, senior fellow, Martin Regg Cohn is hosting Olivia Chow for the next TMU Democracy Forum on Wednesday the 25th at 2 p.m. at TMU. Join us to find out what it takes to win power and manage change as Toronto faces political headwinds. And there's an image of Olivia drawn by our talented team member. Was that Zainab or is it Zainab Chowdhury? All Dais events and talks are free and open to the public. We are building it, and we know that you will come. So please come to these next events, and you can use the Eventbrite platform as well as find out in our newsletter. We'll send more information about those events I just mentioned to those who registered. Thank you so much for those who joined online. We'll shutting off the Zoom webinar now, and for those of you in person, please enjoy the free spirit. Also, I wanted to do a final shout out to Angus Lockhart, Miriam Hamid, and everyone else on the team. I saw Graham Dobbs here earlier, also members of the Dais team who care about these issues. And Rahel, oh my gosh. And Jillian Gonzalez is online, or hello, David, who is the curator of this anti-racism talk series. Thank you so much to all of you.
Okay.
Oh.
That was good.
Yeah.
Good.